Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. We're speaking about the Billy Meier case today. Billy Meier is an 80-year-old man who lives in northern Switzerland. Back on February 3rd, 1945, Billy had his first physical contact with an extraterrestrial human named Svath. But I think if you trace his telepathic contacts, they can be traced back to 1942. Billy met with Svath for 11 years when he was a young boy, as he was growing up. And on February 3rd, 1953, when he was 16 years old, he began his first meetings with a woman named Asket. Asket is from a universe that's parallel to ours, called the Tao universe. And this first meeting occurred in 1953. On February 3rd, Billy was climbing up a hill, a favorite place of his thoughts, and it was a bitter cold early morning hour when he was climbing up this hill. And he sat up there for a while, and he saw this craft come down. Well, let me read just a little bit from this contact report. He says, "Bitter cold prevailed at this early morning hour as I made my way to the favorite place of my thoughts where I often was alone for so many hours, and where 16 days earlier Svath also announced to me the acquaintanceship with Asket, which was intended to occur on this night. In spite of the sharp cold, I broke out in a sweat as I climbed the small hill on which the agreed place was situated." Asket was a extraterrestrial woman from a parallel universe, a universe called the Tao universe, a universe that was created 46 trillion years ago. Her people are known as the Timmers. They are descended from a race of extraterrestrial humans called the Lyrians. The Plaiaran are descended from the Lyrians. Many people on Earth are as well. And this Asket would be Billy's second mentor. And on this hill, Billy says, I immediately saw a bright light plunge down from the sky and set down not far from me on the hard, frozen ground. He saw a silver disc-shaped object which stood on 3 landing spheres. And he had there was a telepathic invitation he felt from the ship. And this is something that used to happen when he would be pulled in the Svath ship as well. He said it felt as if he was being lifted up by ghostly hands, and he was literally kind of pulled into the ship, and he sat down on a very comfortable armchair. And suddenly this light that was everywhere in the ship suddenly went out, and it almost seemed as if he was sitting outdoors. So he couldn't see the ship anymore. And he had a kind of a reflex motion where he drew his left hand back in front of his eyes. And he could see that his body was invisible, the ship was invisible, and he felt himself start to slowly float at a low altitude towards the nearby village where he simply remained hanging about 2 meters over the house of his parents. He's up into the, he's just hanging there over the roof. And he could hear Ascot's voice in his head again and talking to him. And this ship, which was completely invisible, starts to move again, and it shot up into the night sky. He said he felt no G-forces at all. And the craft went higher and higher, and then Billy saw the beautiful stars. And he describes it this way. He says, I saw the stars shine like I had never seen them up to this point in my lifetime, seen them shine like this. They were big, beautiful, glorious, and wonderfully more powerful than I had ever seen before from the earth. And he was in outer space and very high on the daytime side above the earth. And he saw the earth, and it looked like a blue, white, greenish ball. And part of the earth, I guess, was in darkness. It looked almost like the earth was half full. So he's in orbit at this point. And they see that he sees the sun as well. And it says here, indeed, that had to be in the sun, which was illuminated a part of the earth on one side. And I thereby discerned a gigantic area, which must have indeed been the Indian Ocean, while immediately after that, in a westerly direction, it adjoined dim contours which spread out in the dense darkness. It was still deep night in the west, while far in the east, the new day had already awakened and was slowly advancing westward. A truly quite fantastic picture. But I could only enjoy this glorious picture for a few minutes, short minutes, which seemed like seconds to me, as suddenly everything around me began to glow dimly and my vision blurred. And the ship was suddenly invisible again. And the ship had landed, and he hadn't even noticed that it was coming down, but it had floated gently to the earth. And he realized he was in the country of Jordan. He saw the red rocks and the red sand. And then he saw another craft. It was as big as the moon, and it plummeted down at terrific speed, and it became bigger, and all of a sudden it stood in the air at a height of about 80 to 100 meters. Without transition, without decelerating, it just appeared there. Boom. And it slowly sank to the earth. Well, what happens is Ascot gets out of the ship, and somehow Billy feels he knows her. And he said this perception was so very familiar to me that it was able to cause painful feelings for me, because I had indeed missed her in my earthly existence until now. And Ascot's somewhat peculiar greeting ceremony struck me as strangely familiar and known, yet with the best of will, I was unable to find out why she seemed so familiar to me. Well, Billy and her get into Ascot's ship, and they travel to Egypt. And this is a story that I've told many times. I think it's worth hearing again. We're going to get on, don't worry, with Contact Report 5 and talk about the origin of the moon and the origin of Venus. Then we'll also talk about the Might of Thoughts book as well. But let me continue and finish this little scene out. It says here, we plummeted down to Egypt, to the pyramids of Giza. But why, I did not yet know, because until then Ascot had not said a word to me about that. And I'll move forward a little bit. It says, and now the sinking became a gentle floating down to a great pyramid, which I had very well in my memory from many pictures, like the Pyramid of Giza. And I recognized it by the gigantic animal human, which as a statue stood not far from the Great Pyramid, and we sank exactly towards this animal human object, the Sphinx. So the ship lands by the Sphinx. It's cloaked. It can't be seen. Ascot puts a device on his belt, and Billy plays some tricks on some local women there that are getting dressed in their tents, and he proves to himself that he is truly invisible to other people. So Ascot and him, it says here, suddenly Ascot grabbed me by the hand and led me to a small entrance opening to the pyramid. Through long, musty passageways, we walked in twilight through the interior of the pyramid. Then it was so dark that I could not recognize anything anymore. And I wondered about the fact that I did not collide with anything. And Ascot found the way in spite of this literally Egyptian darkness. And the German idiom Egyptian darkness corresponds to a pitch dark. So they finished this long trip, and they're standing in front of this stone that looks like what he calls a giant ashlar, and it dissolves into nothing, and they both walk through. And I'll read a little bit of this because the wording of the Meyer notes is so perfect. You can't. These contact reports are amazing. A steeply descending passageway. They went through the giant ashlar. They're going down this steeply descending passageway, and it was guarded by two oddly clothed men. And Billy could hear Ascot's voice in his head telling him not to say anything. So they both walked silently and mutely past the two guards, who made no initiative against them. And they came to this hallway, a gigantic hall, which seemed to overflow with light. It says here, overflow with light coming from everywhere and nowhere. The hall was giant-sized, as was the gigantic disc-shaped spaceship, which rested there next to smaller ships. A giant spaceship deep below the foundation walls of Giza. Now this is interesting. The ship in the pyramid, or below the pyramid, was 300 meters in diameter. That's 300 meters. A meter is roughly equal to 3 feet. So 800, 900 feet in diameter. Billy had seen a similar ship to this when he was with his father back in 1942 that had stopped very close to a church steeple and hovered near his home. So they were about 3,000 or 4,000 meters below the Pyramid of Giza. And Billy sees this small plateau, and he sees an ancient, large, wooden, Y-shaped cross. He sees nails, blood-encrusted nails, and an ancient wreath of thorns wound many times with abnormally big thorns on which was a red-brown coating. He saw a 2-meter blackish wooden rod and a purple-colored cape, and a pouch with glass pearls and glass stones. Now these were Emmanuel's crucifixion utensils. And Askett goes on to explain what this was all about, and that these Giza intelligences had used religion to confuse the people of the world. It says, in spite of being strongly religiously influenced, it says, in spite of not being strongly religiously influenced, I could not simply and easily loosen myself from these things laying here, which were pregnant with history, because right here actually lay the crucifixion utensils, which had to have testified as to the evidence of the accuracy of certain things in the New Testament. That occurred to me now, and I wondered about Svath words, that everything is only meant to be a deception, that Jesus Christ should have never been called Jesus Christ, rather Emmanuel, and he was not God's Son, and that God is not creation. Only why had Svath told me such things? Because before me lay indeed at least the evidence to the contrary. So Billy's having a bit of confusion here. So Askett and him, after this, talked for 2 full days, and she instructed him in many things and gave him many explanations. One of which was how these people called the Giza intelligences had used religion for many, many years to confuse the people of the earth, to make them vulnerable, to be able to control them. And they had a base far below the Giza Plateau that was there until the middle 1970s or so. Actually, till about 1979, I believe. Now, Semyase was Billy's third mentor, and in 1975, on February 6th, he had his 5th meeting with her, which is what we're going to talk about today a little bit. I don't know how much of this I'll cover today. This is a lot of material. It says, it talks about something called the destroyer comet. And it describes how this destroyer comet would come through our solar system about every 575 years. And how on one of these passes, it brought the planet Venus in. And that Venus came from another solar system entirely, and that Venus was a planet that was in the beginning stages of supporting life. And I'll read these passages to you in a little bit. So, and at this point, Earth was the second planet in our solar system. Now, Venus was put in place. Now, that occurred about 3,500 years ago, if I'm not incorrect. 3,500 years ago. Let me about 3,453 years ago, the destroyer came into the Earth's solar system. And it forced planetary orbits in disarray. As it passed by the Earth, it wrapped it in its huge tail and shook it. Huge storms and volcanic eruptions resulted. People and animals died in large masses. Mountains were moved, and ocean depths changed. On the Mediterranean Sea, the magma walls of the Santorini volcano were torn down and large quantities of water entered into the volcano. This caused a huge disaster because the volcano exploded and destroyed the island. And the explosion produced a gigantic storm surge. So we're talking here, this is 3,500 years ago. The destroyer comet comes through our solar system, and its tail has such an effect on our system, on our planet, that it literally shakes the earth. It causes these huge storms, and this volcano had been kind of torn to pieces, and part of an ocean goes into this volcano, and this causes like what they call a storm surge. And a storm surge recently occurred with Hurricane Harvey, and it went way inland. Well, this storm surge was 2,000 meters high. That would be like nearly a mile high. And it swept across the sea and killed and crushed everything. And in fact, part of the waters turned blood. There were so many people and animals killed that there was literally some of the rivers flowed red. In Egypt, this storm surge flooded vast areas and gave rise to all sorts of plagues. While the flood wave returned and raced eastward towards the sea, the eastern source of the sea. Anyway, this was 3,500 years ago, and it says the planet which carried along had slowly been following in its wake. So Venus, which came from a solar system far away from the Earth, was pulled by this destroyer comet in its tail, and it passed at a distance of about 600,000 kilometers from the Earth, and it got pulled into an orbit around our sun. And it says here, due to its gigantic forces, it forced the new planet into an orbit between its nearest satellites, Mercury and Earth. So that's how Venus got transplanted in between Mercury and Earth. So that was 3,500 years ago. The destroyer comet brought in Venus. And when Venus was brought in, that's when that unbelievable storm surge occurred. That's when the plagues of Egypt occurred. That's when the rivers ran red. It's all in the Bible. It wasn't the activities of the creator of the universe. These were natural forces. To a degree, natural forces. Now, the Earth's moon is a fragment of a small planet that came from a very distant sun system. Our moon is about 4.5 million years older than the Earth because it came from another planetary system. So, and the Earth was, the moon was brought here millions of years ago. And the contact report talks about this large star that was 11 million kilometers that compressed into 4.2 kilometers and became what we call a dwarf star. And this was not a white dwarf, but a very dark dwarf. And this dark dwarf star circled another giant sun for thousands of years. And eventually, this dark star, which has this tremendous gravity, this dark star was a large star that was compressed in on itself. And the material in the star became very, very dense. Sometimes these are called white dwarfs or black dwarfs, depending on whether a light can even get out from them. And this smaller dark star was circling this giant sun for thousands of years, and then finally it falls out of its orbit and it starts to go into this other solar system. And here's it says right here, now already visible as a round sphere, the destroyer reflected the sunlight while pulling a fine veil of particles behind it. Still only a few hundred units away from the nearest worlds, it caused infernal storms in these, which destroyed large areas that had been built by peaceful human beings. Now, at this point, I believe it's in another solar system. This is a complicated contact report to follow. Helpless, condemned to be handed over from life to death, they stared out into the sky to the gigantic wandering planet which was racing like a cosmic death missile. It was only a matter of time before the forces of the cosmos came to display their monstrous powers. On the night of the third day after the incursion of the destroyer into the orbit of the planet, it might have been shortly past midnight when the drifter from outer space penetrated into the elliptical orbit of the sixth planet, causing storms and through the planet belonging to this path some units off of its direction and brought it into a dangerous course towards the sun. So it talks about mountains collapsing and horrific things happening, people fleeing, and 2/3 of the people on whatever planet this is were killed, and the daily rotation time doubled. And the planet circling the sun circles the sun now in the opposite direction. Now this is page 8 in this contact report. I'm skipping through. And the destroyer in this other solar system crosses the course of the fifth planet, doesn't really cause any problems. When it gets to the fourth satellite in this planet, it, as the smallest of the planets, it moves directly in front of the destroyer comet. And this dark star is so dense that it literally, before the two collided, this dwarf planet is ripped apart. And its fragments, now this is what's interesting, its fragments were hurled into the endless expanse of the universe, where they were captured by the forces of stars as shooting stars or meteors and found their final end burning out in atmospheres. Additional parts of the dwarf were pulled into the sun and atomized into this star we're talking about. As if hurled by a giant fist, one half of the dwarf planet shot through a highly developed man-made dimension door into the infinite expanses of space of the Milky Way, a very distant destination. Okay, so now this part of a planet, which will become our moon, by the way, which is in another solar system, is hurled through this dimension door into the infinite expanses of space in the Milky Way. After a few centuries, it becomes roughly round-shaped. So now it's been hurled, and it hurled into our solar system, and it comes near the Earth. And I'll read what it says, it's very interesting. Through this, its course was once again slightly changed, and as a result became parallel to the path of the second planet. Well, when the moon came in, we were the second planet. So this happened before Venus was brought in. which had already begotten its first primitive life. And it describes the Earth this way. It says, the Earth was a planet that was covered by vast seas and dense primeval forests, primitive, deadly, gruesomely fantastic. From this point on, 34 days passed until this planet, namely the Earth, caught the dwarf and submitted it to its spell. The forces of nature were enough to tie the dwarf to itself and let it circle around as a new satellite on a constantly changing elliptical orbit. Since then, it orbits around the Earth as the Moon, 4.5 million years older than the mother star. So what we've been talking about is this destroyer comet, this comet which brought in our Moon. It also brought in Venus. Venus was a planet in a completely faraway solar system that was brought in by the destroyer comet. And there was one thing that I kind of glossed over, which I thought was very, very interesting. That 10,000 years ago, I described this destroyer comet coming through, and it threw the Earth out of its orbit at this time and changed its orbital period. So before the destroyer comet came through, our day was 40 hours long. So you can imagine how different life would have been on the Earth. You may have 20 hours of daylight. Incredible. And you do 20 hours of work in one day. It says here, at that time on Earth, a day on Earth amounted to more than 40 hours, and the sun did not rise from the east as it does today. Such orbital period and rotation direction changes have stricken the Earth twice after the flood, but they have not brought such devastating disasters as the ones caused by the said flood. So this is a kind of a somewhat brief overview of the destroyer comet. This is kind of a hard thing I find to follow. It's a kind of the history on the Earth is extremely convoluted. A lot of really bizarre, amazing stuff has gone on. Some of it is, most people couldn't even follow it. I mean, it's just so crazy. Now, Billy, his writings are like the contact report that I just summarized quickly for you. There's other very interesting stuff in it we'll have to talk about and within the next few days, probably. That contact report that I just read from and described occurred on February 16th, 1975. Billy was talking with his third mentor, a woman named Semyase. His first mentor was a man named Svath. Both of these are extraterrestrial humans from what's called the Pleiadian star system, which if you would travel some 400 plus light years out to our Pleiades and then go through a dimensional door, so to speak, to some 80 light years beyond our Pleiades, you could come to their solar system and you will see a very Earth-like planet called Era. And these people are very, very advanced. They're in what's called the fifth stage of evolution for human beings. Humans have 7 stages of evolution. And it's one of the interesting things in terms of the pattern of our universe. A lot of things occur in 7s. So there are 7 stages of human evolution. The Pleiadian at the 5th stage, we're at the 2nd stage. We're not really compatible to have open contact with them. They're too far advanced. they would find it extremely uncomfortable to be around Earth humans because we have very little harmony in our thinking. So one of Billy's books is called The Might of the Thoughts, and it's all about bringing neutral, positive thinking into the people of Earth. So this book is extremely advanced and very, very important because it teaches us to use the power of our thoughts. And there's a passage in this book that says, "It is the nature of thoughts that by their might alone, everything conceivable can be brought into fruition." So what that means is your thoughts are incredibly powerful. Whether you know it or not, whether you know how to utilize the power of your thoughts are very, very powerful. So you can be inadvertently bringing all kinds of bad circumstances into your life by not learning how to use your thoughts in a neutral, positive way. You need to clarify your thoughts. You need to guide your thoughts. Don't let your thoughts drift on what Billy calls the boat of thoughts, where your thoughts just float. You want to be analyzing your thoughts, and your thoughts will meet these 7 characteristics if they're neutral positive. You'll be confident, you'll be optimistic, you'll be relaxed, you'll be cheerful, you'll be thankful, you'll be enthusiastic, and you'll be in harmony. And then you'll have a balance. At the beginning of this book, a woman named Elizabeth Moosberger, who is the wife of another man named Moosberger, who wrote a very good book on the Maya material called, I think it's called And Still They Fly. But Elizabeth said, and she wrote the dedication to the book, she said that the humankind is ill in its consciousness. The people of the earth are ill in our thinking because we don't know how to think neutral positive. We think either way too positive or way too negative. And you can also have unconscious thoughts, which can rage on and be negative and can create these negative pathways in your brain that just ingrain themselves, and they can literally drive you crazy. So one of the things that we need to do is learn to think independently, because most people are so influenced by television, radio, newspapers, magazines, and other things, they can't think independently. If you think independently, that'll lead to the evolution of your consciousness. But today people are told how they should think by the media, by churches, etc., etc. So people are in a state of being dumbed down. So we need to learn once again to use logic and to think independently. Even at the risk of being incorrect, you should learn to think independently. And I think part of the prophecies are to help us to think independently. But if you don't learn to think neutral, positive, and neutral, positive thoughts, then what's called your human nature will get out of control. And you'll go into a state called asartang, which means to go badly out of control, the good human nature. And it's a very uncomfortable state to be in. And you'll be lost in thoughts of despair or anxiety or anger, and these thoughts will rotate out of control. Your might is anchored in your thoughts, and you are the forger of your own fortune. So your fortune is dependent on your own thoughts and how you choose to reinforce them. Like just a few moments ago, I described the 7 characteristics of neutral positive thinking, where you're confident, you're optimistic, you're relaxed, you're cheerful, you're thankful, you're enthusiastic, and you're in harmony. So when you repeat that to yourself, it reinforces these thoughts in your mind. If you're having negative thoughts, it will push those negative thoughts out just for a while and allow you to think in a healthy way again. And it will allow you to clarify your thoughts. And if you make an effort to practice what I've just told you and you have some patience, it can bring harmony and it will clarify your thoughts. That's what's the beauty. If you can tell yourself those 7 things, it will clarify your thoughts. It will free you from ambiguity. It will take away confusion. So on page 22, it says, all wrong, useless, negative, and impure thoughts are eliminated in order to attain space for the neutral, positive, equalized thoughts. Now, the Meyer material talks about someone named Emmanuel, which I resisted this information to a degree for a while because it seemed kind of absurd to me. But if you do enough research, you'll find that in the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic, and the Latin, there was no letter J. And there was no letter J in any of these languages in the ancient world. Now, so the person that we call Jesus couldn't have been called Jesus. He was either called Iesus or Jesus or Emmanuel, but he wasn't called Jesus at the time of his life. And I didn't believe that until I did my own research. And you can see it wasn't until about 1550 or so, a guy named Gian Giorgio Trissino, an Italian scholar, invented the letter J and started substituting the I and the Y for the new letter J. And then the just sound began here on the earth. But in the ancient world, no one said Julius Caesar or Job. They pronounced these names as with a Y or an I. So the only reason I reiterate that is to let you know that the name Emmanuel is also mentioned in Isaiah 7:14. I think it's Matthew 1:23. Hopefully I remember those correctly. But it says, for the person that we call Jesus today, his name will be called Emmanuel. So if I talk about Emmanuel, I am talking about the same person that's discussed in the New Testament. However, much of his teaching was lost and distorted. One of the most important teachings that Emmanuel taught about was reincarnation, and we'll finish up the show with that. But one thing that he said, which was very, very profound in one of his final teachings, was everything human within the human must die, but everything of creation within them must rise and embrace creation. Everything that the human possesses has its origin in creation, therefore belongs to creation. Human beings shall transform their entire spiritual lives and perfect them so that they will become one with creation. Now, this occurs over 7 stages. There's the number 7 again. 7 stages of evolution. And your evolution depends on you controlling your thoughts. And you are the master of your own psychical state, and you are the master of your own psyche. So your psyche can influence you to live in a state of turmoil and imbalance, or in a state of harmony and equalizeness. Now, if your thoughts are correct, your thoughts are much like a beautiful garden. Our consciousness should be like a beautiful garden filled with plants that are tremendous. No weeds, nothing negative. If you have negative thoughts, you will soon allow yourself to be controlled by negative thoughts. So Negative thoughts have a way of repeating and repeating and repeating. So what you as a human being think you make real. So you need to learn to tend and nurture your good and positive thoughts. Like I said earlier, I'm confident, I'm optimistic, I'm relaxed, I'm cheerful, I'm thankful, I'm enthusiastic, I am in harmony. This is called clarifying your thoughts. It's called nurturing your thoughts. Nurture means to feed and protect. So you need to feed and protect your consciousness so that you can evolve your consciousness. And that's the purpose of life here on the earth. There is a supreme intelligence in our universe. It's called the creation. The creation is neutral positive. It radiates love, but it's so different, very unusual. It is, imagine something that's lived for 46 trillion years. The creation started our universe 46 trillion years ago. So it's been watching whole galaxies come into being, whole galaxies go out of being, whole planets come into growth, whole planets go away. And it's been observing its creation, its physical creation, for 46 trillion years, and it's involved in the forces that start all these processes which go. And it creates within every living thing a spirit form, an immaterial, energetic power that's, in the case of the human being, the spirit form is immortal. It never dies. It records everything that you do, and it will even tell you if your thinking is right or wrong if you learn to pay attention to it. So you've lived literally millions of lives. Now, your consciousness, though, here's the thing. Every lifetime, you'll get a new consciousness. Your spirit form lived many lifetimes. In your subconscious are the essences of all the things that you've learned from these previous lives. They're in your subconscious, and they will impulse your conscious mind. So the fetus, in its embryonic state, the spirit form will enter the fetus at 21 days, and it brings with it a new consciousness, a brand new. So it has to learn. It has to learn to walk. It has to learn to talk. It will be impulsed by its own wisdom from its previous lives that exist within its subconscious. The essences of its love, its discernment, its sense of duty, its logic, its reasonableness, its level of evolution from all of its accumulated lifetimes is programmed into the subconsciousness of the fetus. But the fetus has to go through the whole painful process of growing up again, learning to eat, learning to use the restroom properly, learning again to control its emotions. Now, we are getting these impulses from our subconscious, from our spiritual consciousness. We have both a material and spiritual consciousness. The material consciousness is new every lifetime. The spiritual consciousness accumulates the wisdom of all the previous lifetimes. So if you can learn to pay attention to the impulses of your innermost personality. See, we have an innermost personality that comes from all of these many, many lives. Let me read this to you, and this will make it clearer. Through the consciousness awake ability to access, the human being is able to distinguish the various impulses and values of the innermost nature from the self-created personality. So we have the innermost nature, which is influenced by your spirit, and your self-created personality, which is who you are this lifetime. So here she therefore learns to recognize the various forms of characteristics which on the one hand radiate as guiding impulses from the innermost personality. So you get guiding impulses from your innermost personality, the creational nature, or which on the other hand, the created ego is loud. It's many times these two selves are kind of in conflict. I'll continue here. It says, the human being thereby creates in himself the wisest leader that he or she could ever wish for. And once the impulses of his or her innermost nature, that is to say, the innermost creational personality, gradually becomes stronger and clearer, the human being who makes effort in accord with the creational laws and recommendations is more and more able to distinguish between the real creational truth of the innermost I and the many deceptions of the self-created ego. So we have a self-created ego which has many deceptions. Now, as you continue studying the Maya material, you will quickly learn that there's a vast difference between where the people of the earth are and where these other higher evolved human beings are in terms of their understanding. And we're at a very, very difficult time on the earth, because we are not following the creational natural laws. Our biggest violation is population. And the population is destroying the forests. The forests moderate the weather. In other words, the bulldozer is as much a danger as the atomic bomb. The bulldozer comes in and destroys all the trees. The forests have a way of holding in the warmth in the summer. They do both. They don't reflect as much heat back. And let's say it's the winter, okay? The forests will hold. They will not reflect. Just a barren, snow-filled plain is going to reflect back a lot of the heat and light. If you put a bunch of trees over that, the light will be diffused, which will keep some of the heat in. Now that's the winter time. Now, on the other hand, if you have the summer and you have the light streaming down with just tremendous heat, you have the shade produced by the forest, which keeps it cooler. Now, this is so important because if you don't have moderated temperatures, you have the drastically cold and the drastically hot. The two slam together, you have something that forms like Hurricane Harvey, which is ravaging Texas and surrounding areas. That's why, because we've destroyed our forests, which moderate the weather, through overpopulation, we've destroyed our forests. The forests moderate the weather, so there's no moderation anymore from nature because we've destroyed nature. So now the storms are going to run wild, and that's what's happening with the storm Harvey, and it's dropped more rain. And in Contact Report 136, it says the entire Earth will become flood-prone. Again, because of the destroying of the trees. The trees and the plants are absolutely critical for life. And that's why you see the creation creates all these trees. Because love is the highest form. Love is the highest principle in all creation, and through it everything exists in absolute logic. So all these trees that exist by nature are part of the absolute logic of creation, and because it's part of its absolute love. Now, it doesn't rescue you. Creation is not a father figure. It's just the opposite. It stands back and watches you evolve. It does not interfere with your evolution. The second law of nature is the law of striving, which is the law of evolution. Without work, without striving, there is no life. Now, one of the keys here is that the other third law, the law of harmony, which we were talking about in the Might of Thoughts, helps the law of striving. You'll learn to moderate your striving, to continue in your striving, to not give up in your striving, to keep your thoughts under control so that striving doesn't become miserable. All of this comes from the law of harmony. So if you live in the law of harmony, if you live in the law of striving, and in the law of love, you'll have the next law, which is the law of prosperity and abundance. So if you follow the other three laws, the fourth law becomes available. Now, the law of prosperity and abundance is also being destroyed on this earth because of overpopulation. The greater the population, the less prosperity and abundance to all people, the less harmony there is. Instead of striving for evolution, you'll have the strife of warfare. It also destroys the natural law of love because people do not have the necessary space, the necessary resources to live. So anyway, hope this has given you some insight into what's happened in Earth history, into what you need to work on now. Focus on the might of your thoughts. Learn to be neutral positive. Live within the law of harmony and love and striving. And you'll have the benefit of the law of prosperity and abundance. Hope you've enjoyed the show. If all goes well, we'll be back tomorrow. You've been listening to Ohio Exopolitics. Thank you to all the peaceful people that are listening to the archives. Thank you so much. Have a great day.